So welcome everybody to this panel on what is predatory publishing. We have had a great program this morning with a fantastic keynote and really great panel, but I suspect that this is going to be even better. What are the issues that why we decided to include this, a session on this topic? So predatory journals are perhaps one of the most conspicuous item in discussions about, open access on a global scale. They get, a remarkable media coverage, including New York Times and so on. And yet, there seems to be, I mean, if I can use problematic dichotomies such as truth and fiction, there seems to be a bit of a disjuncture there. That is, I don't think that anybody would not recognize the obvious problems of predatory publishing, and at the same time, the predatory journal has become a little bit of an image. What I mean, think about copyright. So yes, there is copyright infringement, and then there are the pirates. And the pirate has become a figure, right? The pirate is parasitic, doesn't do anything. It's kind of this completely negative figure, often associated with the East, right? The pirates tend to come from there these days. So I think that the predatory journals is a little bit of, we're facing a similar predicament. That is, there are practices that are highly problematic. And then there is this figure of the predatory journal. And that figure is invested with all sorts of assumptions, both defensible assumptions, other moralistic ones. So we want to have this panel to address both those different dimensions of predatory publishing. And in addition to that, we also think that predatory publishing is particularly important for a conference like this, given that the Global South is represented both as the producer of many of the predatory venues, as well as the prey, right? Allegedly, we have a whole, all of us have read stories about, the naive scientist who received this spam emails, and they cannot realize, they cannot tell that they're spam, and so, they pay $500, and then they are shocked when they realize that they just published in a predatory journal. So the South is implicated in this narrative, both as the victim and as the victimizer. The panelists, so I'm just going to introduce them very briefly, and then they will speak in order. So first, Trish Groves, from the British Medical Journal, who could not be here because there is an important event in Europe. And then Kishore Vattikoti, who is an attorney representing Omics, who is a major publisher, often referred to as a participant in this predatory publishing sector. And then Jinfen Shah from East Stradbroke University Library, and most of you have already met him this morning. And then Matthew Hodgkinson, who cannot be here, but he will speak via Skype from Indawi. And also, unfortunately, he could not be here because I think the same event where Trish Groves is. So let's get going. the speakers will take up to 15 minutes, and then we'll try to have an extensive conversation afterwards. So I hope that Trish is online.
So shall I just go?
Yep, thank you.
Okay, all right. I hope you can hear me. Okay, so I was asked to speak about, you know, as kind of from an author point of view. And so I thought I'd frame it understanding that the problem of predatory and fake journals is partly driven by the fact that they provide what people want. You know, I mean, why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you, if you were under pressure to publish something, if you had to do a project in just 4 months with very little help, with very little training, and you had to get something published in what seems to be an international journal and get it on your resume, on your CV, why wouldn't you go to a journal that emails you, that begs you for papers, that offers you very quick turnaround, that charges a relatively small fee for publication, and that sends you peer review comments which are very minimal and easy to respond to? You can see that a lot of people would think, great, you know, they're providing a great service to a lot of people. And that's almost certainly why they persist. If they weren't filling a gap in the market, they wouldn't be so successful. So I'm trying to look at, well, what is it that authors are really looking for, and how should the rest of us be trying to meet those needs? Okay, so that's me. And if any of you are tweeting, that's my Twitter handle. I'm a big fan of Twitter. Being an editor, I need to show you my conflicts of interest. So I hope you're with me and you can still see my slides, yeah? You can see them?
Yes.
It's okay?
Yep.
All right, so that's my competing interests there. You better just read them for a minute.
It looks like you have
Okay,
plenty
it's weird
of
because I can
competing.
hear my voice playing back from what I was saying a couple of minutes ago, but I hope that you're still with me. I'll assume things are okay unless someone sends me some kind of message. So what do we know about what makes authors choose a journal? And the answer is, you know, pretty consistent. There have been lots and lots of surveys. A lot of the big publishers do an annual survey of authors, and they pretty much all come up with the same list of factors that make people choose one journal over another. And they're usually these 4 things at the top, not necessarily in this order, but people seem to care about the reputation of the journal. And that will often be because people they respect think the journal is good and recommend it. Hopefully, and as they say, they seem to be interested in what's actually in the journal and how relevant it is in terms of scope and content to their own work and to what they're also trying to publish. They say they're interested in high quality peer review, although when you dig down, that might mean peer review, which is obviously high quality, but nevertheless, the peer reviewers loved my paper and the journal gave me a quick decision. And then, as ever, the journal impact factor persists as something that people really care about. And that's perhaps not surprising while impact factor is so embedded in the reward systems that we have in academia. The factor that's used to help people get new jobs or to be promoted is so often based on citations, and particularly journal impact factor. So perhaps disappointingly, open access often comes much lower down the list of factors that make people choose a journal, even where their work has been funded by a funder that mandates open access. In the 2015 survey done by Nature and Palgrave Macmillan, with 22,000 authors, although I'm not quite sure what the response rate was, they found very high compliance with open access funding mandates, particularly in China. But they reflected on the fact that that might be because open access funding is very widely available to authors in China, and it's not difficult for them to get the money and to just do it. Right. Of course, something else that authors like a lot is to have their work accepted. So although certainly in medicine, and forgive me, these are all medical journals, but in medicine, you often hear people saying, well, what they're trying to do is get their work into the New England Journal of Medicine. Very reasonably, it's, you know, best journal in the world, best medical journal in the world, but incredibly difficult to get into. Having said that, the advertised acceptance rate for research is about the same there as it is at the BMJ, and the other acceptance rates there. But the difference is with the so-called open access mega journals such as PLOS One and the journal I'm editor-in-chief of, BMJ Open. But there's a reason for that, and that's because we use different criteria. You know, people are interested in getting their work accepted. If they're trying for a really high impact, famous journal, then they can live with a terribly low chance of acceptance. But at the mega journals like PLOS One and BMJ Open, as I'm sure you're aware, the peer review process is different, and papers are not judged on originality or importance for a particular audience. They're judged on their scientific quality and the transparency of the reporting, which is why these journals are much less selective and have much higher acceptance rates. So authors, if they get into either of those journals, are usually pretty happy for different reasons. Another thing that authors obviously care about is having their work cited, because although impact factor is a journal measure, authors clearly really love having their work highly cited, and of course it drives things, the personal metrics such as H-index and so on. And as we know, there are quite a lot of studies showing an advantage of open access when it comes to citation. But actually, this, which is from 2015 from SPARC, the open access sort of advocacy outfit in Europe, acknowledged that although the majority of these studies do show a citation advantage for open access, it is actually a mixed picture, and there are lots of problems with the studies because they tend to be biased and they tend to be confounded by things like the quality of the work. And unless you have randomized controlled trials randomizing submissions to open access or not open access, and there have been a few, but not very many and very small and only in certain fields, then it's difficult to do very unbiased research. So there's a sort of face validity that open access work is more likely to be cited, not least because we all hate it when we're trying to write a paper and you go to look up a reference and you hit the abstract and it goes, pay $75. And you think, oh, well, damn it, I'll just pick another paper then. And anyway, that might be something that you would hope would drive people to open access. But as we know, people are pretty worried about open access as a model. And I'm not just talking about people in publishing who are publishing paywall journals. I'm talking about authors. And PLOS One launched in 2006. And in that first 5 or 6 years, when BMJ Open and other mega journals started launching, there was a lot of discussion about the fact, well, isn't this just vanity publishing? Aren't you just saying, you know, here's $1,000, publish my paper, it's not real peer review? And there was a lot of concern about the fact that there seemed to be this sort of light peer review, and it was all just a cash cow and a way to just publish lots of papers and get lots of money in the door. And hopefully a lot of that concern has been banished by seeing that many of the open access mega journals are of good quality and are doing a good job. And certainly at BMJ Open, we have open peer review, so you can see all the peer reviewers' comments and the authors' responses. And some of the Biomed Central medicine series journals do this too. So you can see how the peer review process is working. You can see it all there. But as we all know, more recently, there's been this assumption, largely fueled by Jeffrey Beal, I have to say, that open access and predatory publishing are one and the same, and of course they're not. We know they're not. The point about predatory publishing is it's just exploiting the ability to publish stuff on the web and the ability to charge people for publication because of the rise of open access article charges. But that doesn't mean that all open access is predatory, far from it. But you know, we've often heard that that's the case. And of course, this has got worse and worse, as not only do you have the predatory journals, but the completely fake journals, and then the fake peer review scandals and all of that. So It's interesting. In the Nature survey in 2015, they reported that people seemed to be much less anxious about open access than they had been just the previous year. But I would be interested to see what next year's survey says and whether people have retreated again from feeling very confident about open access online publication. I hope not, but I wouldn't be surprised if that was what they found in the survey. Nearly there. So there's lots of work going on, and just recently there's been a whole rash of studies and articles on trying to spot the bad guys, trying to tell a predatory journals from a real one. And there's some very good work, and I've just shown some of it here, including the paper on who publishes in predatory journals. And I know we're just about to hear from one of the authors of that paper. So there are great articles and studies looking at the whole picture. But very often the people who are going to fall prey to these journals are not the sort of people who are going to go off and search for or read this kind of work, I'm afraid. You need something that's just readily available to people. So along come the tools. People have now developed tools such as Think, Check, Submit, which was a simple sort of suite of simple checklists which were put together by a whole bunch of international organizations worried about this and trying to help authors to pick trustworthy journals. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with this, but it is a useful tool. And there's more work going on. So, for instance, the World Association of Medical Editors, WAMI, had previously, with the Directory of Open Access Journals, the Committee on Publication Ethics, another organisation, I've completely forgotten which one right now. Anyway, they got together and produced some criteria on best practice in scholarly publishing, sort of what does a good journal look like. But then earlier this year, they came out with a pretty nitty-gritty guide on identifying predatory or pseudo journals. And they pulled together the best of Beall's list, or Beall's criteria, and the criteria used by the Directory of Open Access Journals, and other down-to-earth stuff and published evidence. And they came up with some guidelines which were summed up by this algorithm. And they're basically saying, well, okay, you can start with Beall's criteria, you can try Think, Check, Submit, and then if you're still worried, then go and check the Directory of Open Access Journals, and then follow this tree, and you end up with, ooh dear, probably a bit of a worry. You better spend some time really checking this journal out before you submit to it, is pretty much the bottom line. I've nearly finished. So, good journals respond and provide a good service to authors all the way through the process and beyond. You know, good journals have post-publication peer review of some kind. They have a very active correspondence column so that people can critique what has been published and so on, and they should publish letters quickly and all of that. But they also are willing to admit when they make mistakes, and they're willing to correct the literature and consider the concerns that are raised and so on. Pretty difficult with a predatory journal, and there are lots of anecdotes of people who've realised with horror that they've published in one of these predatory or fake journals, and then think, well, now what do I do? And this is an interesting case from the Committee on Publication Ethics, COPE. COPE, as you may know, is the international organisation which advises editors and publishers around cases of publication ethics. And they have the most fantastic open archive of real anonymized cases. And this is a recent one just from last year, from somebody who published a review article in one of these journals, and they went, oh my God, I don't want it there, I want to take it away. And of course she tried, contacting the journal and got no reply and so on. And she asked her university, can I sue? And the university went, oh no, you don't want to do that. But then she thought, well, I'm going to try it anyway. And she wrote again, sort of threatening legal action. Nothing much happened. And then she approached a legitimate journal and said, would you be willing to submit, to consider this review article if I can get it retracted from the predatory one? And the editor said, yeah, okay. So through that journal, the case came to COPE, for the sort of real journal, if you like. The case came to COPE. And this was the upshot. COPE said, well, give it a go. And she did actually manage to get the predatory publisher to at least engage a little bit. There was an exchange of emails. Didn't get very far, but she sent an email saying, right, if you don't remove it by a certain date, I'm going to sue. And meanwhile, she has gone ahead and submitted the article to the legitimate journal, and that the editor of that journal has said, well, okay, you know, we can have a note explaining what's happened, and I'm not worried about possible duplicate publication in a journal that's not really a real journal, which I thought was a little crumb of comfort here for authors. So lastly, authors, particularly in the lower middle income countries, which we know are those where predatory journals are often coming from, but also where they're most often used, really need some help with this, more help with this. And there's very little support for researchers in some institutions, not in all. Some of them are fantastic and doing a really wonderful job, but it's not the case everywhere. And certainly in India, which has some very high quality research and some great supervision and some great units, there's also a vast number of people who are under enormous pressure to publish something in order to get promoted even in a clinical job or a teaching job in a university. And they often don't get much support. What institutions need to do and what authors need is really clear research integrity guidance within their institutions that covers things like how to spot a legitimate journal. And this is from an editorial in the BMJ. And Jocelyn Clark, the first author, and indeed Richard Smith, actually, are both very involved with Bangladesh's biggest public health research centre, which is the old cholera place, IDDRB. Anyway, that last slide. Food for thought. This is one thing that's happened recently, just this year in India, that the University Grants Commission has made not a blacklist, like Beale, but a whitelist of approved journals. And this is where any teacher, lecturer in a university or other academic staff who have to publish in order to get on in their career, have to pick from an approved journal. So now, you know, is that the way forward? And moreover, is this something that other countries and places should try, that you actually tie together the sort of academic reward system with white lists of journals? I don't know if that's the right approach. You can imagine that there'll always be great journals that ought to be on the list that aren't. But, you know, maybe it's something that is really helpful to authors. It just means, you know, someone else has done the groundwork for them. So with that, I'm out of here. Thanks very much.
Now we're going to hear from Kishore Vatikoti from Omics.
Good afternoon, one and all. And it's regarding the concept of predatory publishing, predatory open access publishing. So I will start with this, the concept of where it has come from. The word predatory is undesirable term for open access publishing. Open access determines the direction and scope of the research work by creating an open platform for the researchers in the similar field to share their ideas openly, thereby becoming a reliable platform for publishing and accessing the research. And the authors are the scholars or researchers in a particular field who are well-qualified personalities and are capable enough of justifying and choosing the journals in which they decide to publish their work. Considering various factors which influencing the criteria of getting the grants of scholarships or funds that shall be allocated to their research work. So, by these few words, I would like to say that the word predatory is not an accurate word for open access publishing, because the authors cannot be made a prey just like that. because they are well-qualified people and they know where to publish, and there is a criteria based upon that. They can choose their suitable journal where they can publish their work. And the open access is made a prey as it is being accepted widely by the scholarly world, and thereby the existence of pay access publishers and their associates may fall in question in the near future. And let me introduce first regarding the predatory open access. The term predatory open access is derived by some criticisms that are afraid of rapid growth and wide acceptance of open access model across the world. And wide acceptance of open access model, as it has already shown its impact on the global south, and it has its roots in the global north too. And open access is believed to be the reliable and efficient source of publishing peer-reviewed scholarly journals on the internet. And this model of publishing only collects the APC, that is article processing charges, to meet their day-to-day editorial, administrative, and technical expenses. Apart from that, they don't charge anything for accessing the content, which should be made open to the scholarly world, so that if there is any similar research is going on, the author will have a chance to look at what are the developments made in that particular field, and they can do some advancements in that. And moreover, this predatory, I believe predatory has come mostly from the small journal publishers, and especially the individual journal publishers. The emerging small publishers and independent journals, to explore themselves to be the part of publishing industry, they strive to get the customers to their business by way of undesirable solicitation of emails. By this, the authors of these small businesses are not so innocent to publish their work, and they often send some email invitations requesting them for publishing their work in their journals. Yeah, with considerable acceptance from across the globe, the pay access publishers, together with some few librarians, especially like Jeffrey Beal or any guys similar to that, who feared of their existence, has termed this reliable platform as predatory, as their existence has been in question. And moreover, we could see this scholarly OA has been disappeared without any notice. And this, the term predatory has been, brought in by that website. And all of the predatory kind of questions and the listing of journals, everything is brought in by that website. And these questionable critics could not mitigate the influence of open access publishing, but in turn contribute in publicizing the knowledge of having an alternative to the pay access publishing model across the scholarly world. And if this model is really publishing the predatory content, why would most of the universities or institutions accept this kind of publishing model across the globe? So thereby this model is being accepted across the world by the prominent universities and also the education institutions across the world. And moreover, if an author intend to publish in a pay access model or the subscription model, so he has to pay for the publishing as well as accessing the content of the research. And moreover, these and in this model, it takes sometimes there is a chances of publishing the article even after 1 year or 2 years. So there is scope kind of thing. So this will not publish the articles in time. So if the author decides to publish his works in time during his academics, it might not be possible. But with open access, there is a possibility. Of course, the author has to ensure that the standard peer review process is done. So he has to choose a kind of journal, open access journal, where his the peer review process is done properly, and also the research is published in time. And with all this, I could propose a regulatory framework to be designed for open access publishers. So all the open access publishers has to form a kind of a grid kind of thing, so which could regulate and implement the best publishing practices. As so many small publishers and individual journals are there, which are which are sending this unsolicited emails and are trying to make the authors a prey to their journals. So for that, I propose a kind of open access regulatory grid. So in which all the prominent the publishers or the individual journals can be their representatives can be a part of that, and they have to design a framework and the guidelines which could which could overcome this kind of wrong publishing practices. And the scope of so-called predatory can be eradicated by this kind of strategy. As the quality of publishing increases, there are more chances of getting articles from the authors without doing solicitations. So if the standard of these even the small journals and the publishers will become good, then there is a chances of getting the articles to their journals without any solicitations or any invitations by these small publishers. And also, there is a chances of getting the journals indexed in the databases as the quality will be improved. So I conclude this by saying the so-called predatory open access publishers should build these strategies. In such a way that there shouldn't be any requirement for solicitations, which is believed to be improving the quality of publishing. And secondly, the open access publishers should consider to design a framework that mitigates the requirement for solicitations. And there is a need for introduction of regulatory grid for the open access publishing, which should be empowered to monitor the publishing practices across all the publishers who are the members in this grid. And this is a kind of regulator grid what I propose, in which there is a process laid out. So the strategy should be dictated by the grid's unique resources, and there should be the capabilities mentioned there. And the environment in the grid should be transparent, because the members of certain publishers will be the part of this grid. So there should be the transparency maintained, and the objective is so designed to give its best to regulate the entire publishing process of all member publishers in the grid. So there should be the transparency across the grid, and the objectives and the strategies, whatever are framed, must be followed strictly. Thank you.
And now we're going to hear from Jean-Fan Xia.
Oh, yeah, okay. I'm more confident talking about this topic, predatory journals, than the topic I had in the morning, simply because my recent research is more in this area, in predatory journal publishing. The previous two speakers have already talked about how to identify predatory journals, how to encourage others to avoid predatory journals, how to, excuse me, to solve problems in journal publishing. But here I want to say they are talking about one part of the population, research population. Okay, here we at the University of California, Davis, one of the best universities in the world. Do we understand there is a group of people with researchers who are different from us? See, like, I don't care it's a predatory journal or not. I'm from a country where English is not my mother tongue. I don't speak English well. I don't read English well, but I need a publication. What if I don't have enough training to start a good research topic, to design a good research, to have good result, but still I have to publish? Because that is related to my promotion, tenure promotion. And that has some kind of a monetary value. Okay? So if I'm in that kind of situation, you tell me that those are high-quality journals with high value and impact factor. You ask me to publish in those journals. I'm not going to listen to you because I'm not able to do this. Okay? So there's a market for me. And that's the predatory journals. There are people out there trying to make journals look like very professional. Because once I spend my money, I publish in those journals, I bring the record to my boss, to my committee, to tell them, here's a record of my publication. Yes, I'm taking risk. The risk is that they run this journal, they run some reviews, they detect that I am cheating on this. Yes. But there's a percentage that I will not have the problem, because what if the journal is published in Brazil, I'm in China? How many people from the committee will actually go to this Brazilian journal to check if this journal is good? Okay, let's say, they go there. They check the journal. And they open the journal's website. The journal says, I am peer-reviewed. Okay? And my reviewers from the committee, they don't understand English. And this publication is in English. So the possibility for me to get my tenure is always there. So I like to take a risk because it's about my future. This is the market. This is, I call the demand and the supply market because there's a demand and there's a supply. I'm sorry that I repeat some of those because they have already given the definition of predatory journal publishing, because when I prepare my slides, I did not read theirs. So if there are something that they have already introduced, I'm going to skip them. We know that there's a librarian from University of Colorado, Denver, Jeffrey Bill, who built this so-called blacklist. We check this list. Then there are whitelists, and this is one of them, meaning that if you register, you're a journal editor or publisher, you register with this, and then they will evaluate the quality of your journal based on their criteria, and then you pass that, you're part of them. But still, even if I know those, do I really care? Or those are just, the history of detecting predatory journals. Probably some of you have already known this maybe better than me, but for those of you who are not familiar with the situation, there are some kind of sting operations. People try to use different ways to detect which journals are good and which journals are not. So those are two of them. They found some unprofessional practice out there. Then I spent a little bit more time on this. This is something that when I answer one of the questions in the morning, and this is something, this is called a predatory impact factor. Okay, we have a group of, I don't care how many, 100, 1,000, 10,000 predatory journals. Okay, we all know that impact factor is very important. But we want to attract others. I'm the journal editor. I'm the predatory journal editor. I want to attract others. I want to make my journal very much professional. And one of those is that I am going to provide you with the impact factor. I have the impact factor. So I have the peer review. I have articles in English. I have my editorial board. I have my impact factor. Okay? So those journals provide a market, demand, supply, market. There are people out there opening website to provide people like me with the impact factor. They ask me to pay for the value. Okay, I give them $100. They give me an impact factor. Of course, I know they are fake. They give themselves some fancy names, like a scientific impact factor, universal impact factor. I don't care. As long as they give me, because I need to provide a link so that if people question my journal, they can click the link and go to that website. And on that website, my journal is there. They verify this. So I have everything. I get the money. You got your publication. So we're all happy. It's a win-win situation, right? So that's the market. Why we need this market? Many reasons. Oh, those are just numbers. Okay. And one of these is the demand and the supply. Okay, if you do the calculation, you open a website by the World Bank, for example, UNESCO, another example. You look at the total numbers, by country. How many people, how many researchers in each country? US, of course, by country is the largest, and China is the second. Then you have all others. So many of them. But how many journals you run at the same time? You run this number for journals. If you do this, you will find, now you have some journals, but you have a huge number of researchers. They are hungry there. They need to publish. Do you provide enough space for them to publish? If you don't, other people will come. Okay, so it's the imbalance of this demand and supply. A good example is that probably some of you have already heard that China has become the largest country regarding the number of doctoral students they provide each year, outnumber the United States. You have so huge body of population, research population, who need to publish. Okay, that's one of the obvious reasons why we have this. The imbalance of population and the demand and the supply market. And the second, I think, the presentations in the morning have already talked about the policies from Brazil, Latin America, from Africa, from Asia. Those countries, they try to join this so-called globalization. This internationalization of science asks people to publish in good journals. But who is going to define those good journals? You want to use impact factor to define good journals? I'm going to use this scientific impact factor, the universal impact factor. So those policies, okay, we only have 100 journals, for example. Then we have 100 countries with this new policy to push their researchers to publish here. And those policies, of course, they define journals differently. Then they try to highlight quality as well as quantity. Quality probably is very difficult because of all those factors I described, like impact factor or something. And quantity is measurable. If you publish 10 articles, let's say, okay, another tricky part is that I publish 8 articles, all in good journals, and then I have two more articles in Predatory journals. So what do you think about this situation? Or something like this. Okay, you have this policy. If you want to use policy to force people to do something, you need to provide the support. Therefore, it's just back again, it's just still the imbalance of researchers' population. Those are just something to show you, the numbers, the charts. Actually, I'm done. That's it. Thank you.
And now we have our fourth speaker, who I hope is online, Matthew Hutchinson. Matthew, can you hear us? Matthew, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Excellent. Welcome. So your first slide is up. So start whenever you want.
Okay, great. So I've been working in open access publishing since 2003. I started as an editor at Biomed Central. I was a senior editor at PLOS, and then I've joined Hindawi last year as head of research integrity. So that's my background in publishing. So we can go on to the next slide. Great. So just a quick run through of what open access is and why we have it. So open access allows the free and immediate reading and reuse with no barriers of anyone with internet access. So it frees up the use of the knowledge and increases visibility. So Trish went over some of that already. Because the traditional publishing model depends on subscriptions, then the open access model flips that on its head. You don't have the subscriptions because nobody's charging for access. And so the way that you pay for the journals has to change. And the article processing charge was invented by Biomed Central initially. And this was based on the fact that there already existed page charges in traditional journals. So those still exist in some traditional journals as well. So as well as the readers paying to access, then also the authors also have to pay charges, color figure charges, etc. And so this is a model of payment that scales with the amount of research done, and in areas traditionally that have expanded with open access, particularly the biomedical sciences, then the grant funding can help to use to pay for the open access publication. There are other models such as Cielo in Latin America. You can have consortia models. The Open Library of Humanities now has a model where libraries subscribe and then get to decide how that publisher is run. So there's various ways to fund it, but because you don't have subscriptions, then you have to use different routes. There's always been the accusation since very early on. I remember at BMC, the accusation that we will publish anything. And this is something that we've countered as open access publishers by having rigorous peer review and showing that we have that and maintaining the reputation. This was always the argument that publishers had, is that if we will just accept anything, our reputation will go through the floor and then nobody reputable will want to publish with us. So on to the next slide. So there has those since about 2008 been a rise of suspect journals. There have been suspect journals before, but there is definitely this trend. There's this idea of cargo cults. It was originally, I think it was Richard Feynman in the 70s, looking at physics research, talked about cargo cult science, and there are now cargo cult journals. So the idea of the cargo cult was in the Pacific Islands during World War II, the American soldiers would land there and they would set up makeshift airstrips, and then there would be a lot of cargo. So a lot of goods would come into those islands. When the Americans left at the end of the war, the people who were living there, they saw that the goods were no longer arriving. And so they would set up landing strips and towers to try to replicate this, to try to get the cargo back. And so the idea is that you go through the motions of something, but it's not really doing it properly. And so there has been a rise of journals who have the appearance of a standard journal. So they have a website and they have an editorial board and they say they do peer review and they publish articles. And yet what they're doing is that they're cutting corners, and then there's a pretense and deception. And so as Jiafeng was describing, there's certain deception in indexing. For example, people will claim to have an impact factor when they do not. They will claim to be based in a certain location when they're not. And so this is one of the characteristics of these journals. So they've risen since about 2008. Gunter Eisenbach at the time began calling them black sheep, but then later Jeffrey Beall coined the term predatory publishers in about 2010, and that label tended to stick. There's problems with the predatory label to some extent because the motivation of a particular publisher is not always apparent. Some poorly run journals can be run out of naivety. And so those are publishers who you may be able to work with to improve how they work. So naivety and inexperience, but sometimes the problem comes with hubris, so that people are overconfident and then they don't take on criticism, and then they double down in their approach. And that route causes big problems. Clearly, Jeffrey Beall's done a lot to widen awareness of this, but clearly there were problems with his approach, because he wrote an article, ironically, in an open access journal, which essentially was saying that open access was akin to a communist plot, and I'm not really exaggerating there. And although he did eventually publish his criteria, they were somewhat subjective, and it means it's difficult to do this comparison between those who are okay and those who are predatory. So doing that binary classification is problematic. There's also the problem that some traditional journals have very poor practices. Elsevier, for example, collaborated with Merck to produce some essentially fake journals. That was sometime in the 2000s. They also previously published medical hypotheses, which had a dreadful reputation and wasn't open access. And so the problems with journals don't tie to open access, but it's clear that the business model has opened up a space for journals. Often it's areas where there's a lot of English language or as a second language, and very tech-savvy areas. So you have places like China and Nigeria and India where a lot of journals operate out of, and they may look slick because of good web design, but they won't necessarily be run well. So next slide. So this is just an example of how there's a difficulty of extrapolating from single examples. And so when an open access journal publishes an article that's seen to be substandard, it will get extrapolated to say, oh, you're a predatory publisher and your peer review is obviously awful. But here we have an example from biophysics, kind of connected to a systems biology journal published by Elsevier, well respected. And the article was about whether it's ethical to heal a young white elephant from physiological autism. If you can get hold of the article, it's an interesting read, but it's not the kind of thing that you would equate to be sound and reputable science. But Elsevier didn't get labeled a predatory publisher as a consequence, and the journal didn't get delisted, etc. Next slide. So along with the rise of suspect journals, we also have a rise of author misconduct happening during the same period. So as an editor, we've definitely seen a rise of this since about 2010, 11, 12. There's been a big spike. Lots of publication ethics cases. We've seen peer review fraud, where the first instances of this were in 2012, and now recently Tumor Biology, which at the time was published by Springer, has had to retract 100 articles, which is an enormous number at once for peer review fraud. There's now markets for articles and for authorship, so people can buy their way onto the first authorship of an article or the corresponding author. And there's third-party services who are offering to get authors have their articles published. They manage the process, and publishers are often approached by these article brokers to try to get us to publish in bulk, and we refuse, and the Committee on Publication Ethics has made a public statement about this. And this is particularly a problem in China and Iran, where there's these author mills that are coming about. And so next slide. So this is just a kind of quick visualization where if both parties are ethical, then everything's okay. If one's unethical, then you've got problems. And if both, then nobody's operating correctly. And essentially anything can get published, and it may have the appearance of a correct process, but those articles will not have gone through a correct process. They may not actually be, they may have just been fabricated anyway, and so it's definitely a lose-lose situation. We could also complicate this by adding in an element on competence and incompetence rather than ethical and unethical, because things are not always black and white. You should you should look for incompetence before you say things malice, but this is just a simple example. Okay, so go on to the next slide. So how have people responded to the rise of suspect journals and suspect publishers? So the open access movement, I think, has taken a while to take on board that this is a problem. I think it has somewhat damaged the expanse of open access. It has tarnished the reputation. There was always, as Trish was saying, the idea of peer review light, but the emergence of journals that could very clearly be seen to be bad actors has held back the open access movement. So in 2008, the Open Access Scholarly Publishers Association was launched. So Kishore's a decade late to the party for wanting a kind of a body of open access publishers who will come up with best practices. That's been in existence for nearly a decade now. And the applications to join OASPA, only about 10% of applications were accepted last year. So there is stringent screening on new members. COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, has come up with transparency guidelines and best practices for journals and publishers, and this is very useful. I was just at the COPE seminar for their 20th anniversary, and there was one session was entirely dominated by a discussion of predatory publishers. So it's something that's a very live issue among the publication ethics community. You've also got the Director of Open Access Journals, and they were stung by including some disreputable journals, so they now have very stringent screening. Only 4% of applications from India were accepted since 2014, for example. So lots of the journals coming out from India and some other countries who are producing a lot of these new online journals, they're not meeting the criteria that the Director of Open Access Journals expect. And these are not arbitrary things, but they're about proper governance of the journal and having proper standards in place. Governments now have also reacted, as people have mentioned. I think then the FTC have taken action against a publisher not too far away from the panel. That's the US Federal Trade Commission, so there's active legal action now to take action. There's the Indian list of journals, as was mentioned. The problem with that is that it's not machine readable, it's a scanned PDF. So we need to do some work to make sure that these whitelists are actually usable. What do legitimate publishers do? So one thing is to set up research integrity teams, such as we've done at Hindawi, and Biomed Central have done the same. Lots of traditional publishers as well are doing this. It's something that was previously more on the side of people's jobs. This is something I did at BMC and PLOS as well, but now it's a dedicated role within publishers. There's also a very strong separation of financial issues and editorial matters within open access publishers. So you need a firewall between the two. And you need to have a good waiver policy in place to make sure that if people cannot pay because of the country they come from or particular financial situation, then that's something that you can, and you have that operated by people entirely separate from the decision-making process. We've also found that the acceptance rate has dropped over time in many open access journals. Trish quoted the +1 acceptance rate. Well, when I was still at +1 last year, the acceptance rate was more, actually dropped around to 50%, and that was from about 80% at launch. So things have, it's maybe the quality of the articles coming in or stringency of the process, but things have got tighter. And at Hindawi, actually, we have an acceptance rate of about 20%. So yeah, there's been, I would just say that legitimate publishers don't threaten to sue their critics for $1 billion. Okay, next slide.
Matt, sorry to jump in.
Okay, problem.
We're a little short on time.
Okay,
Okay.
I'll rattle through this.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Okay, so the Global South. So I've experienced a lot at AuthorAid, which is a mentoring service for authors from developing countries, and on Quora as well, which is a questions and answer service. That there's a lot of researchers are worried about this, and so I've been asked quite a few times to assess individual journals. And so one thing that we can do a lot is teach people using things like Think, Check, Submit about what the characteristics are to be able to tell whether a journal is reputable and whether they're telling the truth. So how to double check the claims. This isn't just a problem for the Global South. There was a Canadian business school recently was in the press for a lot of their faculty were publishing in suspect journals. And globally, we need to just realize and remember why research is done. We're not doing this just to publish for the sake of it and to get promotions and to get grant money. We're publishing to forward scholarly understanding and knowledge and use that knowledge to improve people's lives, hopefully. And if we allow a decline of standards, then we're simply just going through the motions and not publishing sound, rigorous science. Okay, I'm done.
So, because we started a little late and we don't have technically a lot of time, we'll slide into the 50 minutes that we have allotted for a break. So we'll have a little bit of a shorter break. Questions? I think Mackenzie.
This is not a deep philosophical question, but I think it's an understatement to say that this phenomenon is undercutting the popularity of open access in universities like this. I get email at least once a month or so from a faculty member who is besieged with spam email from publishers asking them to be on editorial boards, submit articles, you name it, sometimes dozens in a day. They respond to try to unsubscribe and it triples overnight. So they're just desperate to figure out how to stop this from happening. And they have no intention of, submitting an article or participating. But then they're telling everybody that, all of these journals are bad, open access is bad, it's just the world going to hell in a handbasket, right? So, so they're demanding that we set up blacklists or whitelists or something that will allow them to just quickly and trivially decide, what email to accept and what not to accept. And I have no idea what to do because I agree philosophically, they're not necessarily predatory journals. They are meeting a market need, but not this market. Maybe we should just say, so what? You have too much spam, join the club, and get on with your life. But I wonder if there isn't, that's why they love Jeffrey Beal so much. It's not that they agreed with him philosophically, but he was solving a very, very specific problem, which is giving them an easy way to say, I need to read this, I don't need to read this. So without that around, what should we do to help academics sort through these issues without necessarily judging them because they really are struggling just to figure out how to respond to this technological phenomenon? Any thoughts?
Let me try to answer that at the top, to communicate with you, not answer this. About 10 years ago, I myself had something exactly like you described. I was a young scholar, working very hard for my tenure. Then one day, I received an invitation, of course a lot of invitations, but that one seemed to be very good because that's a large-scale publisher. and with some journals looking like it very good. They invited me to be an editorial board member, and I said yes. Then a couple of days later, I recognized it's not a good publisher, but too late. I asked them, send an email, letter, trying to use different ways to contact them that, sorry, I do not want this. I want to withdraw. But still, I don't know. It's been a couple of years. I have not checked that. I don't know if my name is still there. This is, I think, quite unique. When I reviewed articles, and one of our articles talking about spam emails, inviting them to be an editorial board or a reviewer. And there's a very interesting research with the number facts of emails, number of emails of different factors, in those emails and something like those. Try to find some kind of correlation between something and something. Yes, something. But I don't know if there are two academias in the world. One is the normal, the regular, the very good one, and another one, unfortunately because of the market and how to regulate this, policies or something. I think there are answers, but I don't know.
So, James Leach.
Thank you. Sorry, I don't know whether any of you know, but this year the Australian government has removed publication counts from the way they calculate block grants for research to Australian universities. It's just an indication that maybe there are other ways around that people could think about this. Whatever you think about the tertiary education policy of the Australian government, it's an interesting move to make in the light of this discussion.
I'll take my prerogative of the chair to put in my my question, and this is addressed to the everybody on the panel, and as I think that Mackenzie still has not received an answer to her question, and James' remark, I think it needs some commentary too. So in the trying to keep things in time, I think we should just go around, ask a bunch of questions together, and then the panelists will address them. So my question has to do with the discourse of the Predatory journal. Okay, so I'm not in any way questioning the fact that we have plenty of low-quality journals that, for some money, whether that's a lot or a little, they publish all sorts of stuff that could turn out to be crap. Okay, so I do not question the facts. What I find strange, speaking from somebody from a field where we don't believe in distinction between black and white, good journals, predatory journals, these kind of dichotomies are kind of suspect to begin with. So I find it strange that here you have a librarian in Colorado who's a perfectly smart guy, comes up with a list, and everybody, despite the fact that they have questions about how the list is put together, they adopt the list and the term. Okay? Then we also see that people keep cranking out these hoaxes. They keep sending out nonsensical papers, and then say, when they get published, say, "Ha, look at that, they got published, they didn't peer review." I mean, at this point, it's becoming a genre. The hoax is becoming a genre. So how many times do we need to do we need to tell the same joke, right? So this is, in my view, it's a blatant, simple case of othering. Right? We had a conference here last year on metrics, and one of the participants says, look, the so-called predatory journals are the best thing that could have ever happened to the good journals, because they can say, oh, look, the predatory journals do this, or the predatory journal don't do this. We are the opposite. Right? So I'm saying that the so-called good journals, if the predatory journals didn't exist, they should invent them, just to, to construe themselves as the good journals. I mean, this is a blatant case of othering. You use the other to construe yourself. This thing about predatory, the victimhood, we have evidence, and you have given us more, about the fact that we're talking about there are markets. There are markets with people have certain access to certain moves and not others, right? The fact that people get swindled, to me, is highly dubious. I'm not saying that some people are not swindled, but I'm just saying that on average, I cannot believe that all of them are swindled. Again, I'm being a little cynical here. So you are a publisher who wants to pretend that you are the best. So you don't attack your customers. You're not going to say, you B-class scientist publishing in D- class journals. No, you are the good guys. The journals are the bad guys, right? So it's a way of allocating blame on your competitors while saving, without insulting your potential customers. So I think you understand, again, I'm not in any way disputing the existence of weak journals, okay? I'm just saying that the discourse of the predatory journal is so bizarre. And I find it surprising that, on this panel, there is a certain tendency to say, yes, there are problems with the label, but. So I would like to, to ask the question, do we need the term predatory? Or can we come up with a different discourse to address the same problem without moralistic or kind of this, business branding? Because I think that's what we're talking about.
So
anyway, it's open to everybody. And if you want to add questions so that we let the panel.
And we have some comments from our remote presenters.
Matt, did you want to go first?
Oh, okay, sure. Okay.
Yes.
In the long term, I think one of the solutions to this issue is to get rid of perverse incentives. So we have to, as the Australians have just done, get rid of counting publication numbers. We have to get rid of looking at the venue of publication. So if we get rid of journal metrics as something that is used to judge authors or institutions, then that will stop people pretending that they have prestigious journal metrics. So look at the research as it stands, assess, this is what research assessment is supposed to be about. And if we can do that and then stop counting publications, it will also reduce bad practices like salami slicing as well. And I think ultimately reducing perverse incentives and improving training about good publication practices will remove a lot of this problem, because some of the reason that researchers are not getting into established and reputable journals is that their research or the way that they write it and present it doesn't meet the standards of those journals and of the editors and the reviewers. And so if we can improve the quality of that research and the way it's presented, I'm helping, for instance, volunteering with AuthorAid to do just that, then we can solve some of this problem. I think on the issue of the discourse of the predatory publishers, it's not really been a label that I've ever been particularly fond of. I tend to use other terms like suspect or disreputable or other things, or describe the behavior rather than using a label, and it gives you a better result. However, I will say this, but there are journals out there who are actually engaging in practices very deliberately and very knowingly that are fraudulent, especially where there's hijacking of journals. There was one called Wolfinia where it was Swiss Austrian botany journal, and that was hijacked and pretending to be a multidisciplinary online journal. And that kind of practice is absolutely unacceptable. We should not equivocate about the practice of some of these journals simply because they might be based in the global south. That's not a good way to go.
And how is the behavior of very reputable journal in overcharging subscriptions? So how is that not predatory? And I don't mean it as a joke. You know, how is that not predatory?
Yeah, I'm not going to defend subscription publishers. I've never worked for a subscription publisher. It isn't a model I think is the future of publishing. However, I think there's a kind of whataboutery in this argument. Oh, well, you're criticizing our journals, so we'll criticize something else about your journals. And I don't think that's a good approach. It can be legitimate to criticize traditional journals for their practices, and they're not immune at all from issues of bulk publishing and publishing poor research because it helps them justify their high subscription and big deals. But this should be a separate discussion and not oh, you're criticizing these poor open access journals, so we're going to turn around and attack your subscription model. Separate the critique about we're criticizing particular behaviors and practices because they're a problem. We can also critique traditional journals, but it's not an either-or situation. You can do both.
I agree.
Well, I think probably we too much simplify the publishing dynamics. There are predatory journals, there are non-predatory journals, but there are journals with high quality and with low quality, as well as journals that are new without experience. So we need to talk about this in a very complex way.
Can I chip in at some point? Sorry, it's Trish. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a way it would be helpful just for a few minutes to step away from, you know, the debate as it's going at the moment. What is it that journals provide that, you know, knowledge needs? And journals provide a peer review service. Sure, you can get that somewhere else. You can pay for a portable peer review service. Good journals provide some sort of curation of the accepted work. They provide archiving. They provide dissemination. Many journals add value with things like editorials and, you know, social media and all sorts of things. So fine, you know, I'm entirely of the view that journals may not have a future for very long, but people are going to want those things somewhere else, particularly in something like medicine, my field. People want to know that something that is published has been kind of vetted by other people with knowledge in the area. At our journal, at the BMJ, that includes patients. We have patient reviewers. So, you know, it isn't necessarily a sort of elitist expert thing, but it is about making sure that you can reasonably rely on what work is done and how it's disseminated. I'm agnostic about how those things are provided. But the problem with so-called predatory journals is just that they're entirely responding to a need, which is this crazy machine where you know, research is done in order to get a publication, in order to get a job. And that's just a waste of everyone's time and effort. And that's not what scholarly work should be about. So for me, there's this wider debate. And if, you know, when I go out and I meet doctors and other researchers in places like India or China, which I do a lot, or in Mexico City, where I was just a few weeks ago, you know, people are saying, some of them are saying they genuinely want to do research because they have genuine need and desire to advance knowledge. So we need to find better ways to do that. But it's going to cost money. You know, the movement towards green open access, where universities or governments or other bodies are providing open access repositories, if they're also going to provide dissemination and peer review and decent curation and discoverability, that's going to cost money. And in the end, they will become publishers. They will become university presses. They will become publishers, and we'll be kind of back to square one. So, I mean, maybe you've been discussing these things at other parts of the conference. So I'm sorry I didn't join for this session. But in a way, I think it's a distraction to get really hung up on the fact that there are some quite smart people who've thought, hey, there's a business model here, let's exploit it. You know, it was ever thus. There are exploiters and crooks in every walk of life, and sometimes you have to admire their chutzpah. You know, they've cottoned onto a good business, and they found people who are willing to pay, some of whom know what they're doing when they pay, but they're happy. Sorry, I don't know if that helps.
So let's, you and then up there briefly, and then we'll let the panel respond.
I want to paint two pictures. One is IBM, Microsoft. Now, you had a time you buy a computer, you have to buy each application. And then Microsoft wakes up one day, gives the whole pack, you pay a little, you have everything there. And so you have Apple, you have Windows. Now, when you talk Apple, most Apple users are in the US. But when you go to the South, almost every other person has a computer. What does he have? And make any form of Windows. You can put anything together and you have something you call a computer before you. That's what I want to join with. There's a market. And if you do not appreciate that that market exists, then you have a problem. Now you have standards here, US standard, that one standard, that several standards to match things out there. But over there are no standards. So in the same way, you have these, whether you want to call them predatory, in the publishing market. They've always been there, and they'll continue to be there. So what do we do? What led to it? Now, take BMC, for example. BMC charges you as much as $2,000 US to publish your paper. That's a whole lot for a researcher in the South. Then somebody comes by and says, if you just give me $50, I'll let you have the same paper. He has sent the paper before to BMC, and he says, your work is not in our area of scope. And so he has to go through some difficulties. He has to be accepted that his work is relevant, and then he has to meet a whole pool of money to pay. Now, if that's the case, then what is he going to do? So you need to look at this. Now, I don't think we should put so much energy on, getting the predatory people out of market. I think we'll put energy on trying to make sure that those that we consider non-predatory should come up with something. We should come up with, for example, let's take tenureship and promotion. Who set the standard? Is it a national standard or is it a university standard? If it's a university standard, the same university can come up with a list of journals they think is permissible. Because we must search for a solution at some point. Until we have that global standard that we may have, which I don't think we can have right now, we're always going to have such people who are actually quite smart. And they will continue to steal from researchers that are naive and make them publish work that are not good enough. But as regards the term predatory, I think we should do it with that term. And maybe because if you have, we're setting up some journals, and then they brought the term predatory. And I took Jeffrey's standard and I put it before the chairman of the board of the journals we're about to set up. And I said, you should read it. He read them all. I said, now, can you separate your set of journals from these? He says, no. I said, because you're just starting. You will solicit it for papers and all of that. So if solicitation becomes a condition for being predatory, then you failed also. So for me, I think we should, for her, please come up with a list. Work with people that you can, I'm trying to provide a solution now. Work with people that are around you and come up with something that you can at least use for now. Let it be open. It should be updatable, upgradable. Let it be open. But it should not become a standard for some other persons. Everybody do something they can work with for now. In my university, we do that. We work with something for now. But outside that, it's really going to be something we'll never come to. We just keep talking, and those will still be making money anyway. Thank you.
Yeah, just one quick comment. I'm Jason Rollins. I work for the company that publishes the Web of Science and some of these other things. So probably admittedly a little bit more focused on the global north, but we do make a lot of efforts to look. We specifically do never use the term predatory journals, but we make a lot of effort to try to quantifiably and objectively look at the practices of journals, things that are included on the journal citation reports, for example. I realize that's also a little bit further downstream. It doesn't necessarily help folks who are submitting a paper, although we're experimenting with things for our online paper submission system as well. So we're looking at indicators. We're using sophisticated computational techniques to look at patterns to see where things are suspect. And it's not just one person's subjective list of things. We're really trying to be as objective as possible, and we're very publicly saying that we're not presuming any negative intent on anyone's part at all. We're actually trying to do quite the opposite and look just at the numbers. So that doesn't necessarily solve any of these problems here. I just wanted to make sure that was part of the discussion, because it is something that we're putting a lot of thought and effort into, and it seems like it's at least tangentially relevant to this. So.
I'm glad you used the word quantifiable. When I'm doing the research on predatory impact factors, I look at the criteria they use to calculate impact factor values. Those criteria items are not quantifiable. They just try to use something very subjective, very difficult. Two persons may come up with a total different definition of something. That's questionable.
Any additional very, very, very quick responses from Kishore, Trish, and Matthew? I guess thank you to everybody, and sorry not to have Trish and Matthew here in person, but next time. Thank you.